He's an American classic, such a profound writer, it's hard to believe Amor Towles began his career as an investment banker on Wall Street, where he worked for over 20 years. Initially, he wrote in his spare time during nights and on weekends, and eventually he finished Rules of Civility, published in 2011. It became a bestseller that year, and the rest is history. He went on to write A Gentleman in Moscow, which spent 59 weeks on the New York Times bestseller list. Towles has sold more than 6 million copies of his novels, translated into more than 30 languages. They've earned him tons of accolades, including landing him on Bill Gates and Barack Obama's annual book recommendation lists. And not to mention, his latest novel, The Lincoln Highway, was a Read with Jenna book club pick back in 2021. I had the chance to sit down with Towles most recently at the Aspen Ideas Festival with an audience full of fans, where we talked about what led him to writing as a child and dug into the inspiration behind each of his novels. I'm Jenna Bush Hager. Welcome to Read with Jenna. I am so happy to be here with somebody that I adore. So thank y'all all for being here.
Thank you.
Okay, so Amor, there's a part of your life story that is so wild, it reads like a bit of one of your novels. Take us back to when you were 10 years old and that message in a bottle.
What Jenna's mentioning is when I was about 10 years old, my family would summer off the coast of Massachusetts on Martha's Vineyard Island, and I threw a note in a bottle into the ocean. And I think the first sentence says, to whoever finds this, I hope it made it to China. That was my vision. So this is late in August. The summer ends. We go home, and my mother's going through the mail, and there's this little letter like this big. And she says, Amor, there's this letter for Amor, and it's been typed out, Master Amor Towles, and in the upper left-hand corner it says New York Times. And it turns out that the person who ended up finding the bottle was a man named Harrison Salisbury. And Harrison Salisbury was really one of the great giants of journalism in the history of the New York Times, and had been the Hanoi correspondent for the New York Times during the Vietnam War, and was an international correspondent around the world. And eventually he was the person who was charged with launching the op-ed page for the New York Times as a senior editor. And so he had found the bottle, and he says, Dear Mr. Towles, I'm afraid that your bottle did not make it to China. But made me. But so we ended up in a correspondence that lasted from the time I was 10 until I was 18. And when I was 18, the first time I went to New York City, I met him. So I got to meet him in person after this extended correspondence. And so the odd part of the story here is that my writing process is I don't tend to do research really until the end of the first draft of any work I'm doing. And so when I wrote A Gentleman in Moscow, I didn't do any research for the work. I wrote the first draft, and then I carried the first draft to Moscow to begin revising the book in Moscow, because I had never spent a night in the Metropole Hotel. And I figured that would make sense. Let's go live in the hotel and revise the work there. And so to get ready for that trip, I went and I started printing out first-hand accounts of life in the Metropole Hotel from the 1920s to the present. And there were many, because if you were famous and you went to Russia in the 1920s or 30s or 40s or 50s, you either ate at, danced at, slept at the Metropole Hotel. So I had first-hand accounts by John Steinbeck and E. Cummings and the playwright Lillian Hellman. And then I realized that all the journalists from the 20s through the Cold War all wrote about the Metropole Hotel because that's where they drank. And so all the bureau chiefs did this. And so as I was getting ready to go, all of a sudden I'm checking one of these memoirs, and one of the things it says is, that was the night when Harrison arrived, and da-da-da-da-da. And I was like, oh my God, I completely forgotten that Harrison Salisbury was also the Moscow bureau chief for the New York Times. And so I thought, he must have written about it. And sure enough, he wrote a memoir about his life in Moscow. So I got a hold of the copy. I took it to Russia. And in the hotel, I read through his memoir. And In the course of rewriting the book, I ended up weaving a number of things that he had seen firsthand into the narrative, such as the day that Stalin died. The day that Stalin died, nobody would release the news. They were worried there was going to be a coup. And suddenly tanks surrounded the city of Moscow, and all foreigners were told they couldn't leave their buildings. Everybody was under sort of temporary house arrest. And Salisbury gets sort of a signal that there's something can be seen from the Mexico attaché's apartment in the corner of the hotel. And all the journalists flood in, and all these limos start pulling up to the building across the street. And among them is, in essence, a hearse. And they take out the coffin of Stalin. And what the senior people who were worried about the coup had decided is, we're going to announce his death, like, as we unload the body with the entire Politburo there. Because we don't want any backroom actions of somebody getting the secret police to take over the city, et cetera. And so he witnessed. So I incorporated that into the novel. And then I was sort of letting the revision rest. And all of a sudden I thought to myself, if I'm going to incorporate Salisbury's memories into the story, I should incorporate Salisbury. So that's in the book. It says the American journalist Harrison Salisbury goes into the room and witnesses this. And late in the novel, for those of you who read it, the main character needs a disguise. And so from the coat room in the hotel, he steals the trench coat and fedora of the American journalist Salisbury when he needs the disguise. And Mr. Salisbury had passed away by that time, but that was my way as sort of a young, someone who had been shown sort of respect by this older man and who had had this long-standing conversation with me. It was my way of trying to pay him back a little bit.
All from a message in a bottle.
All from a message in a bottle. It's true. Oh, thank you.
So first Salisbury and then Peter Matthiessen.
Yes.
Who became a mentor to you in many ways. Talk about how he influenced you.
I began writing fiction in first grade. It's when I realized this is really what I want to do. And for other people who have fallen in love with an art when you're young, you have this sort of dual life between 10 and 20 or whatever, which is that half of you through your adolescence is thinking, I can do this. I think I could really be a writer. I think I have this talent. And you kind of compare yourself to your peers and then to actually other people you're reading and to your heroes. And you sort of keep measuring yourself and saying, yeah, I think I can do this. That's half. The other half is, I am out of my mind. I may be a total joke. There's no way I would know. And so you kind of live in this uncertainty as you continue to write and read. And as I say, this would be true of any young artist. And during that time, like, the compliments that you get from your mother don't matter. Your mother matters a lot, but like that isn't what makes the difference. And so then I got to Yale, and Peter Matthiessen, who I admired as a writer, came to visit for a semester. You had to apply to get in. I got into his seminar, and after a couple of weeks, at the end of the seminar, he said, "Hey, do you mind, could you stay after class for a minute?" And so everybody left. And he said, "Listen, Amor, I don't know anything about you, and I don't know why you're here. I don't know what you want, but based on the 3 stories that you've submitted, I think there's a possibility that you may be gifted at this. And so I'm going to take your time here very seriously. And I hope that you are going to take your time with me just as seriously." And, that was a major turning point in my life, because that was the first time that sort of an outsider, someone who I admired and who respected, sort of acknowledged the work that I was doing. And, I tell other young artists, this is a very important moment in your life as a young artist, but you don't need it to happen every year. You need it to happen like once a decade, because you can ride on that. 5 years later, you're still like, Peter Matthiessen told me, to yourself, not to the public. But anyway, so Peter ended up being my mentor, both in my craft, but also this major figure in terms of, giving me the additional confidence to think that I was not delusional. But
the one half of you that said, I don't know if I can do it, might have won out a little, right? For a little bit, you went to Wall Street.
Well, yeah.
A little bit, right?
I did go where I worked in the investment business for 20 years. And
what did Peter say when you told him that's what you were going to do?
Yeah, what he said was, I was working on Wall Street. I was 25, living in New York, and I was broke, and I was a little claustrophobic. I was feeling lonely and claustrophobic, so I did go into the investment business, and I stayed. A friend of mine, I helped a friend of mine build a firm, and it was an enormously satisfying career. But along the way, I got to writing fiction again on the weekends. But before I got back to writing fiction, Peter did take me aside and said that his experience was that everybody he'd ever known who had gone to Wall Street had never come back to the arts, and that I should assume that my life as an artist was over. And that was kind of the dread that would be true is kind of what ended up getting me to go back and start working on weekends and at night. And eventually I wrote a novel over 7 years I didn't like, and then I wrote Rules of Civility. And then when that became a bestseller, I resigned. Thank you.
And you got to speak with him after Rules of Civility was published, right?
He did. He was alive at the time that book came out. And so we had lunch, and that was a great relief. Yeah.
Can you share any of that conversation, or you like to keep that close? This
is the only thing I'll tell you about it, because it's kind of funny, is when I finished Rules of Civility, the first draft, I sent it to him. And I said, Peter, I just want you to know that I've been working on it. And, and this is the first draft, and I feel really good about it. I think it's probably the first book that I've written that is really worthy of submission. And, and I'm interested in your feedback. And there's a 25-year-old woman who's the center of that book. She's the narrator, and it's set in the 1930s. And his letter comes back, and he says, listen, first of all, Amor, I can't understand why you're continuing to write about the 1930s. You're always writing these stories about older America, and for some reason you won't write about your own times. And he says, but to tell you the truth, I find that this is a terrible thing. I find that spunky, opinionated, witty women are as boring in fiction as they are in film, as they are in life.
Wow, he probably wouldn't have liked me very much.
So I was like, oh man. So it's like, damn. So you kind of you put the letter in the away, and you're like, oh damn it, So then the book ends up getting sold at auction. I revised it, but it gets sold at auction, and then it comes out and it becomes a bestseller. He sends me a note the week it hits the bestseller list. He sends me a note, and he says, Amor, this is what we call eating crow. And he said, my sister, who's one of the greatest readers I've ever known, says that the minute that your book ended, she was sad it was over and wanted to start again. And he's like, and that's as much as you could ask, And so he was very sweet about sort of recognizing. But I got to say, the serious thing, again, for young artists, well, middle-aged artists, old artists, whatever age you are, is in a way, in retrospect, Peter not liking that manuscript was almost as valuable as the confidence he showed in me at the age of 19, because it sort of meant that, this book ended up working despite the fact that my hero, my mentor, my first real supporter, it wasn't for him. He didn't like it, And that was it's a lesson that at a certain point as a young artist, you have to sort of say, you know what? I have to have the confidence in the work myself, even if my mentors or my heroes or my friends don't like the manuscript, you have to have the confidence in your own work. And so that was sort of a weird gift in its way.
Coming up next, Amor Towles shares his process for writing and discusses how his novel, The Lincoln Highway, was inspired by his late father.
Hi, book lovers. This is Ellen Hildebrand, best-selling author of 30 books, including The Hotel Nantucket and The Perfect Couple.
And this is Tim Ehrenberg, creator of Tim Talks Books.
We're the hosts of Book, Speech, and Beyond, the hit literary podcast presented by N Magazine, where we dive into the wonderful world of books, speaking with special guests from best-selling and award-winning writers, agents and editors, book influencers, and more.
That's right, Ellen. Season 1 has included conversations with Taylor Jenkins Reid, Kristen Hanna, Jake Tapper, Ann Patchett, Jodi Picoult, Read with Jenna's very own Jenna Bush Hager, and other big-name authors and publishing industry insiders.
We tackle topics like what it's like to take a book to the screen, the art of creating iconic characters, the intimate details of an author's writing process, and maybe a little bit of the gossip, too.
Oh my gosh, like that time we tried to get Jake Tapper to sing to us.
So we hope you'll tune in to Book, Speech, and Beyond, available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts.
And be sure to check us out on Instagram at Book, Speech, and Beyond.
Happy reading!
Let's talk about The Lincoln Highway. I found it to be a little humorous that after reading Gentlemen in Moscow, which takes place over 3 decades in one spot, you took to the open roads in a 10-day period.
Yeah.
Did that feel like a relief?
Yeah. What I'll tend to do is I'll develop multiple ideas at all times. And so in my office, I have ideas for books which are written out on a 3x5 card. I have ideas for books which are written out over 4 pages in a notebook by hand. But in some cases, I have multiple notebooks where I've been thinking about a story for a long period of time and slowly building it out in greater and greater detail. And I have multiple stories that are kind of fit that profile. So when I finish a book, I kind of look to those stacks to say, what am I going to do next? And so it is not a coincidence that having written this book that spanned 30 years with an aristocrat, a sophisticated sensibility at its center that largely takes place in space, I'm immediately like, oh yeah, I'm going to do that story about the 3 18-year-olds on a road trip for 10 days because I get to shift gears. Now, to some degree, it's sort of a liberation to kind of be able to, I get to go talk about movement. I get to do it in a fast-paced fashion. But part of it is the real desire to shift like that is that when you go from a 30-year story with a sophisticated sensibility in a single location to this sort of 10-day road trip with 3 18-year-old young men, what it requires you to do is retool all the elements of your craft. Because all the various elements of craft that you could think of, setting, plot, metaphors, similes, allusions, the tone, the point of view, the very vocabulary, all would be very different in order to serve this other story. So when I make a shift like that, what's really exciting for me, is that I have to sort of set aside everything I've just learned through writing A Gentleman in Moscow and kind of start from scratch and start to ask myself, what is this going to sound like? What is the vocabulary now? What is the poetics now? What's the pacing? How are the settings described? What are the tone, the voice of the people? And all that's going to be different. So it's a whole new effort of invention. And that's what's fun for me. And then I hope that's fun for the reader too.
It was so fun. But one of the things that I loved is it was partly inspired by your own father because he lived during that period.
Yeah.
And the Lincoln Highway itself is, such an important part of it. So kind of go into all of that, please.
Both?
Setting all three, your father, the highway, and the time period.
So,
you don't have to do it in that order.
Yeah. So when I have an idea for a story, like in the case of the Lincoln Highway, usually it's a sentence that captures my imagination. And in the case of the Lincoln Highway, for those of you who read it, you could probably guess this. I thought one day, what if a kid on the way home from a juvenile prison, being driven by the warden, ready to start his life anew, discovered as the warden drove away that 2 kids from the prison had hidden in the trunk of the warden's car. That's kind of what I started with. And when I have an idea like that, if it's interesting to me, usually it comes very quickly with some attachments. So within a matter of minutes, I thought, this is good. This is going to be set in the 50s. It'll start in the Midwest. The farm will be going into bankruptcy. The kids in the trunk will be from New York. The hero will want to go to West. They'll want to go to New York City, so they'll go to New York City. And it'll be 10 days. All that I know within a matter of minutes. And then you go through this multi-year process of trying to imagine the whole thing in detail. Now, what Jenna was referencing earlier is that I did not ask myself why 1954. It felt like the right time to tell the story for a variety of reasons. Let's go with it. And you start to imagine it from there. And the more you imagine, the more sure you are that it's where the story belongs. And, once again, I didn't do any research for it, but I felt very comfortable telling the story for whatever reason. And only really when I got to the very end, I was, finishing the first draft, did it occur to me, this is kind of embarrassing in a way, is that this takes place in June of 1954, the 10 days, and the 3 main characters are all about 18 years old. And all of a sudden, as I was kind of wrapping up, I thought, I bet, my dad, who had died just a few years before, I thought, he must have been about 18 in 1954. Mm-hmm. And I went back and kind of did the math, and sure enough, he was exactly 18 in 1954. And I was like, as soon as I thought, I was like, of course. Because what it occurred to me was that we are, all of us, forever, are all enormously influenced by, let's call it, the decade between when we're 6 and 16, let's say. Because whatever is happening in the world between 6 and 16, culturally, politically, whether there's wars or depression, what's happening in the musical scene, that will forever influence kind of the way we see the world and how we think of ourselves and what we tell our children, et cetera. That's a big influence on us, whether we're kids of the 60s or of the depression or the world of the war years. And what had occurred to me as I was sort of thinking of this is that the second decade that has almost as much influence on that decade for us is the one where our parents were that age. Because when our parents were that age, being influenced by the world, that's what they bring to us and to how they parent us and how they describe the world and how they, what they expect of us and the rules they give us and the morals they give us, et cetera. And so, as I said, as soon as I recognized, I thought, oh, right, this world I've just designed in 1954, all the various ethics of the characters and the battles they're having, and it's really an expression of the world that my father and mother had sort of raised me under the shadow of, if you will. You know what I mean? So I knew much more about it than I would have thought even myself, in the same way that any of you would know a lot about the world as it was when your parents were teenagers.
It's so interesting. And the Lincoln Highway, it connects our country,
Yeah.
but it isn't really a highway anymore.
Well, yeah. It's really